Okay, so we are the House Environment and Energy Committee, and this afternoon we are going to take up state municipal regulatory barriers for fair zoning and housing affordability under a bill that is on our wall, H68, introduced by Representative Bongartz. And this is a sort of general beginning to our conversation about the housing conversation, and then also S100, which is currently in our housing committee on this side, but it will be coming to us later this week. So welcome, Representative Bongartz.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime.
Okay. You'll hear a lot about the depth of the housing crisis in Vermont. We have, as you know, effectively a zero vacancy rate. Employers can't find people to work because there's no place for them to live. We all know. I won't go into that. So over the course of the summer, I pulled together a group of about 15 people, different stakeholders, including a few EDs of regional commissions, a couple of town planners, Office of Regional Equity, Evernorth, VHCB, Vermont Natural Resources Council, Vermont Housing Finance, and all the kind of players you might think of. And we decided that, and the Department, by the way, of Housing and Economic Development. And so as we talked about it, we decided that the place, if we were going to focus our efforts, was to focus on municipal zoning. Because the people building housing will tell you that the Kathy Byers of the world and others, it can sometimes serve as, because many of our zoning plans and zoning ordinances were developed in the 60s and 70s, and there's still, a lot of them are still holdovers, large lots in downtowns, those kinds of things. It can be very difficult to build housing in downtowns. And the other way to think about this is that Vermont Housing Finance is estimating that we need about 40,000 units of housing, new units of housing in the next 8 years, just to meet current demand, and a little bit of extra for people who might be moving here in a very small vacancy rate. And if we're going to build, if we agree that that's numbers right, and if we're going to look to build 40,000 units of housing in the next 8-10 years, whatever it is, we've kind of got two choices, which is build it in downtowns or sprawl. And it seems to me kind of obvious. What we don't want to do is encourage building like that in farmland, forest land, and encouraging sprawl. What we want to do is encourage construction of housing or additional units in downtowns. And so that's the premise of the bill. And so the sort of subtext is that the way that our zoning works in some towns, and by the way, this is changing, I'll get back to that in a minute, but in some towns that are with the large lots, excess parking requirements, et cetera, so it ends up having a discriminatory impact because only people of means can afford to live in downtowns because we drive up the costs through some of the things that we do with our local ordinances. So I want to go back to something I said a second ago, and that's that a whole lot of towns are moving in the direction of this bill. I met, for instance, with the Londonderry Planning Commission yesterday about this, to talk about this bill. They invited me over, and in the end, they were saying this really isn't going to affect us that much because we're already doing most of the things that are in this bill. And that's true, I think, in more and more towns. But what we're trying to do is, rather than wait 30 years for the inertia, for the towns with inertia to get, was just like clear some of this stuff out. Let me just talk about a few key things that the bill does. In no particular order, the bill, and by the way, this bill is the core of S100. So when Senator Ron Hinsdale put together what is now S100, she asked me if she could use H68 as the foundation for the bill. I said, yeah, go ahead, because I knew housing was going to start in the Senate. So take H68, plug it into the center and build your bill around it. And that's what happened. And I think we'll hear today that most of H68 came back over N100, relatively speaking, intact the way that it was introduced. Because when we pulled that group of stakeholders together, we also went through about 15 drafts. We met weekly and looked at draft after draft just to get it into the best shape we could possibly get it by the time it got introduced. So rather than just have a concept and introduce it, do the best we can, thinking through a lot of it ahead of time. And that, relatively speaking, that seems to have held up. So a few things. The bill focuses much of its attention on towns with sewer and water, but not entirely. There's also a lot of the bill that adheres statewide. One of the things that adheres statewide is the notion that anywhere you can build a duplex, anywhere you can build a single family home, you can build a duplex. The theory being single driveway, basically no bigger footprint, no more land use issues than you'd have with a single family home, and why not get 2 for 1? So anywhere you can build a single family home, you can build a duplex kind of by right. We had a statewide zoning standard of a minimum of the towns cannot require more than 1 parking space per unit. That's been modified a little bit in S100, and we thought it might be, but the idea is not to build our lives around cars and the expectation everybody's going to have cars all the time, everywhere. And because parking spaces, especially in downtowns, add a lot of expense. And so we said 1 parking space per unit. And accessory dwelling units, Ellen's going to go through this, I know, but accessory dwelling units are held to the same standards of review as a single family dwelling. Allows towns to give administrative officers the authority to approve minor subdivisions. So in other words, 1 lot, creation of 1 lot without having to go through the planning commission. It just simplifies it, shortens the process a little bit. And if you've already said that it's allowed, why not let your town administrator do it? Clarifies existing law. The character of the area cannot be appealed in decisions of certain types of housing. And I actually forget exactly what that adheres to, but the basic idea is that you have designated saying that these areas are for housing. These are residential areas. And then when somebody wants to build housing in that residential area, we don't get to say that's not consistent with the character of the area, because by definition it is. So, and what does though, the way that we wrote it was that if the planning commission says it can't be the basis of an appeal, the character of the area. So, because that's one of the ways that housing is frequently appealed and drags out the process, especially when it's an area we've already said. Basically, one of the things this bill does is say, make your decisions up front. Don't do after the fact planning. Don't use the zoning process to do your planning. Make your decisions up front. If you say you want housing, you get housing. And we have a provision. This is not directly in line with what I was the sort of train of thought I've been talking about, but it prohibits towns from adding. This was a little bit controversial, but there's a reason for it. It prohibits towns from adding stricter energy codes than the stretch code. And the reason for that came from, frankly, Evernorth saying this is driving us crazy. Because rather than have one standard that they know they have to build for, every town having different standards, where you can, for a lot of extra expense, you get a tiny incremental benefit, is just not realistic. And so the stretch codes, as all of our architects friends are already telling us, I suspect, are really hard to get to already. And then adding more on top of that makes it, it just kind of becomes unreasonable. There's provision that says, in a housing development with covenants, any new covenants cannot require more than 1 parking space, because so you can't subvert what the intent of the law here is. And you can't require that a house be of a minimum size, because that's one way that those places can become exclusive. And we're trying to, of course, encourage building smaller houses, not larger houses. So we've got the provision we had includes those 2. We had a lot more in there at one point, but we worked it down to just those 2 things. And in areas that have sewer and water, we said 2 things in particular. There's 3 more things I want to talk about. In areas with sewer and water, we said towns must allow at least 5 units an acre. There's a huge public investment in sewer and water paid for by everybody, and to have it then be subject to large lots when that's a really inefficient use of that public resource. And so in areas of downtowns, neighborhood development areas and downtowns, we said you have to allow at least 5 units an acre, and you also must allow multifamily housing up to four plexes, because that's an efficient way to build and make it possible for people to live in downtown. I mean, one of the premises is that people of low and moderate incomes deserve walkability and access to services. And that's one of the underlying principles here. There's one other key thing I just want to talk about, and it's called the by right provision, BY, not BUY, BY right provision. And that is that, speaking of not doing after the fact planning, if your town plan says, again, I'll just use the 5 units per acre as an example, have 5 units per acre in a downtown, the planning commission at a hearing under pressure from neighbors cannot say, we'll approve this if you lower it to 3. Because that's what happens all the time. As we talked to the summer, we heard a lot about that. And so if you're saying you're allowed 5 units an acre, you're allowed 5 units an acre, period. That can't get, the planning commission can't negotiate that away. And actually, I think a lot of planning commissions would be relieved with that provision because then they can say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. That's state law. And so they're not. That is kind of, there's more to this, but those are we're going to do a walkthrough anyway of S100. But that's the key provisions here. We limited this in scope to what we thought we could do well, which was really focus on, in large measure, municipal planning and zoning. I do want to talk about 2 other quick things. Actually, now that I think about it, mostly because I kind of like them. They're not the most important parts of the bill, but there's a couple of studies that we tacked on to the end. And just thinking about in areas with sewer and water and a building that is like 3 or 4 stories high, right now you have to have 2 means of egress, which, on one level makes sense. Right. And if you have an elevator, it has to be a full-size elevator. So what we asked fire safety to do was look at and do a study, do an analysis as to whether, if the building is fully sprinkled, you can do just a single staircase. That's the European code. And as I understand it, Seattle has now adopted the European code. Because a second means of egress is a lot of money. And if you're talking only about, a building with 6 or 8 or 10 units, whatever it may be, downtown, being able to have, again, we're looking at ways to make it possible to build more densely in downtowns. And second, now, in the end, the analysis may be, you need the second means of egress. The other one we asked them to look at is whether you actually need a full-size elevator in all instances, because the elevators are built full-size for stretchers. That's the whole concept. On the other hand, if you're talking about a 4-story building, as somebody in my 20s who served on the rescue squad, we used to carry people up and downstairs all the time and never thought a thing of it. I would now, but I didn't then. But the difference between a half-size elevator, if you will, which is plenty, if the idea is to have people be able to live where they want to live, wheelchair attendant, groceries, whatever, a half-size elevator is fine. It's a lot less expensive because when you go to a full-size elevator, you need 3-phase power. It's more space and a lot more expense. So the difference between 3-phase and single-phase is a lot. And so if we're looking at ways to really look at how we can build more densely in downtown so that we're not building outside, we're not encouraging sprawl. And those are just 2 things that I thought was worth putting in and asking fire safety to look at. That got modified. And by the way, I think we ought to go back to the language we have here. So
thank you for that.
I'm trying not to go into too much, just conceptually.
So Representative Pat.
Okay. 3 quick questions about the parking limitation. One is that the same in the Senate bill?
I believe the Senate did something that said in areas with sewer and water and town centers, how would they define them? We did it with neighborhood development areas and designated downtowns. I think they left it at 1. And then in the, if you will, out in the hinterlands, they allowed, depending on whether there's access to buses or whatever, to 1.5 on the theory that people who live in the country often do need to have 2 cars. But we also, anyway, so that's what they did.
Okay. And does that apply to just to new units, or if there's an existing building?
By the way, it's new units.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's not saying that you can't have 2. The developer can do that. It's just that the town can't require more than 1 in downtowns. It's not that you can't do it. If the developer decides that's what makes sense, that's what we need to do in order for this project to work, fine. It's just that the planning commission or the zoning board can't require it.
Okay.
Especially in the instance where the developer doesn't want to, is saying 1's enough. Units will sell at 1 and so be it.
Only, I mean, just if there's if that's one way of having some flexibility, but just my first thought, I understand wanting to limit it, but it will also limit access for some households who by necessity need to have two vehicles. And in not all cases in a particular neighborhood will there be sufficient street parking to accommodate.
There was a lot of discussion about that in the Senate.
All right.
We'll talk about that more. So
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm curious if anyone has done an assessment of existing zoning statutes around the state. Like you said, a lot of towns are already doing this. How many aren't? Or how do we know this needs to be done?
Well, mostly from the 3 EDs and the planners who were involved, just talking about it as
Regional Planning Commission directors, is that what you mean?
Yeah, the three regional planning directors. And a couple of town planners, and actually also the experience of Evernorth in particular. But as there been we talked about getting an assessment, it was just like a major task to try to figure out how to do that.
Does anyone do assessments of our zoning?
Well, regional commissions,
Have to approve them, but do they kind of inventory and evaluate them in a quantitative way?
I don't know.
Great, thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you.
That we're gonna have Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale join us via Zoom. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Can everyone hear me okay?
Again.
Great. I can answer both of those questions. First, I wanted to thank Representative Bongart and everyone who worked on that group effort and H68 that we, really absorbed and I think had to inquire around and question and make our own. But it was a really great foundation to start with. And, we had to stop sort of talking about this group that met all summer and fall because, we as legislators have to look at things on our own. But this is a nice moment to stop and really just thank Representative Bongartz for all of that hard work because it did lay a wonderful foundation for this bill and for a conversation that is not unique to Vermont. New Hampshire, Maine, Montana, in fact, a lot of northern states are looking at duplexing, triplexing, and quadruplexing by right and finding those gentle infill opportunities, that ability to create kind of rural to urban density. So we're following sort of a national pattern of really trying to revisit what it looks like to have starter homes available to people. As I've been talking about the bill with lots of partners, I see Commissioner Hanford there. The governor started his journey as a homeowner in a duplex. The lieutenant governor did, I did, duplexes, and these smaller units can really afford people the opportunity to gain a foothold in our state's housing market. And of all the statistics, that I carry around with me from working on this bill, one that struck me from an environmental perspective, and a quality of life perspective is that almost 70% of Vermonters live in a household of 2 people or less. And so when you look at our housing stock and you see a lot of big historic homes, when we hear about, older Vermonters who are just heating part of their home and, trying to stay warm, living in 1 or 2 rooms, when you hear about people trying to downsize and let the next family take that building over, it's extremely real. It's a vast majority of the state. And I think you also know that it was more recently discussed in the press, but it's something we looked at a lot, around a lot as well. A quarter of our housing was built before 1939. So when you couple that together, we need people to be getting into these larger homes, fixing them up, new families, people who want that type of housing, and just give agency and choice to others. And, that's a lot of what this bill is about. I don't see Ellen in the room, but I want to thank David and Ellen for their help with S100. And particularly, I think you'll appreciate that, Ellen bounced back and forth between our committee and Natural Resources and Energy for, weeks, probably 6 weeks. And, she really, hopefully you'll see a much cleaner looking draft than all our little tweaks and amendments and corrections. But between our 2 committees, we had a very long conversation, and I think a groundbreaking one, about sharing this jurisdiction and really balancing the needs for human habitat and wildlife habitat. And when I went into Senate Natural Resources, I said something I'll say to you now, which is, when I'm not in the building, I teach environmental justice policy at Vermont Law School. When Senator Bray isn't in the building, he's a builder. So, we kind of switch places in how we think about and visualize with the impact that these things will have on Vermont. But it really created for a wonderful partnership. And, there were so many moments where we were about to lose 2 people on our committee, and he was about to lose 2 people on his committee with a change. And, we just really, I think, found common ground between our committees in a way that is really necessary to meet the moment. Overall, in the very big picture, this bill tries to remove barriers to multifamily housing and end discrimination against multifamily housing, and invests in workforce housing. And, as Representative Bongart said, I mean, essentially people just would ask over and over, are we contributing to sprawl with this bill? And are we just helping second homeowners? And we were very careful in our deliberations to try and ensure we were not contributing to sprawl. And I will say, multiple times that if it felt like we were contributing to sprawl, if we thought what we are doing would start to develop farm fields and people would see a project in their viewscape that they just absolutely hate because of this bill, they're not going to want to talk about housing for the next several years, which we're going to need to do. So, we didn't want to swing the pendulum so far in the other direction that, people don't want to have this conversation as we try to build a new path forward. So, the sunsets around some of the Act 250 and development related provisions we're jointly agreed upon because we want to signal to people that we're having a long-term conversation and we're turning the dial very slowly. I know that Kate might have a map that we put on the Senate floor when we did our bill that kind of helps visualize a lot of the recurring characters in this story, the village centers, the growth areas. Thanks so much, Kate. It might be, we had really big versions on the Senate floor that you might want to have access to as well. Our geographic services folks, John Adams and others, were huge partners in just finally helping us visualize this. I will say, Madam Chair, our bill includes a desire for data collection for a kind of zoning atlas so that we can look year after year at where, what types of zoning exist where, and that it be interactive, because it's hard to look at a map and sort of see what you need to see, but where.
Oh, well, we've frozen for
A lot
us.
of these.
We missed the last bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, it just told me my internet's unstable. Sorry, hospital. Can you hear me okay now?
Again,
So I was just saying that we're grateful to Geographic Services and John Adams. We are looking at zoning atlas and more interactive maps So there are versions of maps like the one before you now that if you click on them, you can see the actual, square miles of the village center or the growth center or the downtown. You can really interact with the map, and we'd like to do that for zoning as well in partnership with the committees of jurisdiction. But what you're looking at here is, like I said, the cast of characters for this bill. A lot of the small dots are those designated areas that we're talking about. And there's certainly more yellow dots, the village centers, than anywhere else. And the village centers in our final bill have to get a certain type of enhancement that, should be a reasonable but meetable threshold to then have more housing units that don't fall under Act 250. In many ways, we tried to focus specifically on these areas for any changes that exempted a project from Act 250, but I don't think there was this belief that Act 250 overall is, quote unquote, the problem. It was really a desire to get housing moving in places where we have determined that growth should happen, that we need, and to revisit what to do to help make Act 250 something that, with municipal planning and zoning can sort of work in concert. And you'll see another effort at experimenting with that in a delegation process that probably will take some time, but allows some of the bigger designated areas to look at absorbing the Act 250 criteria and folding it into their own process with the approval of the Natural Resources Board. I think what we determined is that Vermonters love the Act 250 criteria. And, we just need to make sure that the process pre-application onward, isn't stopping good housing projects from happening. But we know that it has worked well. And at the same time, our committee wants to continue that conversation because it doesn't necessarily mean it's Act 250's fault, but we here 50 years ago, like we started this 50 years ago and it's worked great. Well, in the last 50 years, Black home ownership in Vermont has also been cut in half. It was 38% in 1970, it's 21% now. So we have some metrics that are showing us it's been harder and harder for people to access capital and starter homes. And so we have to take all of this in balance. 50 years ago, we were also engaged in urban renewal practices in the state that limited where immigrants had, access to small homes in downtowns. So, things have changed and we still need to take stock of that. I guess I'll try not to go into too much detail with the bill and we can stop sharing the map. This is on our website and hopefully now available through yours or whatever will be helpful. There's lots of maps that we looked
I
at.
think it's better, maybe we'll see if folks have questions. We do have Ellen here with us. We're going to do a walkthrough, so we don't get too far into the details. I think Representative Smith has a question for you right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Should this still be all in housing, in general housing right now, or is this something that we need to be taking up now?
Well, land use is in our area of jurisdiction.
Pardon me?
Land use is our area of jurisdiction.
It is. Okay. I'm just curious. General housing hasn't finished up with this, have they?
Not to my knowledge, I think they just got it and they're looking at the second half of the bill, kind of fair housing onward. The second half of the bill, I think, is where we tried to make specific investments in affordable housing and workforce housing. And we've, just for the inside baseball of it all, our appropriations committee, similar to yours, kind of pulls that out and looks at it in totality of all the budget requests. But it's helpful for both housing committees to know what we're prioritizing. Is it VHIP? Is it rental revolving loan, missing middle? And we have lots of investments that look at things like home sharing, things that I think are, the Vermont way, very environmental, just that gentle process of building density and co-housing. So they're looking more closely at that. And I think it's, the wisdom of your chair to just start this conversation now, because we had to have a lot of small conversations on our side throughout the 6 weeks that they were working on S5 and we were working on S100. And then they had it for another 2 weeks after that.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Great.
It's also the exact process, not exact process, but what we did was 226 last year. Jurisdiction was split between the two committees.
Yes, it happens often with this area, Brian.
Okay.
Do members have further questions for Senator Rom Hinsdale? I don't think so. I don't want to-
Representative Bongartz was right about the parking issue. We were worried about, how this would potentially limit some growth. And again, it's a floor, not a ceiling. We took it up to 1.5 in places where they don't have like a nearby parking garage or something else to help alleviate parking pressure. And of course, that 1.5 can be rounded up. And usually with larger projects, that does allow different types of families with different types of transportation to be able to still access this kind of density. Our committee certainly is not the transportation committee, neither is yours, but we feel like the next big frontier is to look at housing in relationship to transportation. And this was a nod to that, but continued work for quality of life for Vermonters.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any last things you want to share with us before we start our walkthrough?
I think we just heard from over 100 people. We heard from people in large and small communities and in the more urban and rural corners of the state. We really tried to balance a lot of those needs and concerns. It felt like we would lose one organization right when we gained one, and now we're kind of in the gray space where no one's really happy. And I think that means, our committees did their absolute best to sort of find the fine line in Vermont, recognizing that we need a just transition, that people are going to look to our state as a climate stable place in the future. And we need to be ready to shape that change before that change shapes us. And so we need to know where we want to build that housing and start to chip away at this crisis and just look at it as a national crisis, but one that has unique Vermont features that we can tackle in a way that is still unique to Vermont and our landscape as well.
Great. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That members, we have copies of S100 for those who need them. And yes, please join us, Legislative Council.
Good afternoon, Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. Today I'm here on land use in the housing bills. And you just heard about S100 passed the Senate. Bless you. So Kate has just handed out paper copies of the S100 as it passed the Senate, as well as my summary chart of the bill. There were typos in the last version, so if anyone saw last week's version, I fixed the typos. As with all things, my drafting is iterative, so apologies if anyone had the prior version, but the April 7th version hopefully doesn't have any typos. So this bill is fairly long, and so if you're looking for quick references, hopefully the chart can help you, but otherwise, I'm going to start with a walkthrough of S100. And I think you also heard from Representative Bongartz, a lot of the elements that were in H68 do appear in the first few sections of the bill. But then there are quite a few topics in this bill. So broadly, the sections that I wrote of this bill are sections 1 through 25. Which I think gets us to page 34. So it's going to be a little bit of a long walkthrough. So bear with me. But different topics than what we've been talking about recently. So
now for something completely different.
Yep. So on page 1, section 1, the first few sections are in regards to municipal zoning. And the first one is about parking. So currently municipalities have the ability to adopt provisions related to requirements for parking. This is adding new language starting on line 11 that says, for residential uses, a municipality shall not require more than one parking space per dwelling unit or accessory dwelling unit. However, a municipality may require 1.5 parking spaces per dwelling unit if the development is located more than 1/4 of a mile away from public parking, or the need for parking cannot be reasonably met through the use of on-street parking, public parking, or shared parking. Municipalities may round up to the nearest whole parking space. It also it goes down to clarify further. So down on line 19, in determining the number of parking spaces for non-residential uses and size of parking spaces required in these regulations, the appropriate municipal panel can take into account other things. And so it's clarifying that they do still have the ability to set the number of parking spaces for non-residential uses, but for residential uses, it's creating this baseline in the statute.
Representative Smith.
May I ask a question? What does 1.5 cars look like?
So the last sentence there, municipalities may round up. So that's going to be one of the keys here is that if it's a single unit of housing, they will be able to round up to 2 units, 2 parking units if they want. But I think a lot of this bill does talk about multi-unit dwellings. And so with multi-unit dwellings, you'll just add 1.5. So if it's a duplex, that would be 3 parking spaces.
Why wouldn't they just say 2 parking spaces then?
Because they didn't want to.
Good answer. Thank you.
Imagine if you're building 10 units and not every unit needs 2. So, it could be an average. Parking spaces just add cost. So the idea, I think, is to be practical.
Don't look at me.
All right,
Okay,
that's page 1.
All right, thank you.
Parking is a complicated issue that people do usually have a lot of thoughts about. So yes,
Many of us, most of us have a car and need to park it.
yes. I will point out at the top of page 2, the last sentence of this section. Last year in S226, I believe, that bill looked at a couple of changes to accessory accessory dwelling units. So last year, this last sentence was added that said, a municipality can't require more than 1 parking space per bedroom in accessory dwelling units. So in statute currently, there's already a step in this direction. But this language, the new language on page 1 is broader than that. So this language is being struck. So section 2 is in 4412. And there are multiple topics in this section, but they are all related to municipal zoning. So on page 2, down on line 16, in any district that allows year-round residential development, so any district being a zoning district, so we're talking about towns with zoning, duplexes shall be an allowed use with the same dimensional standards as a single unit dwelling. In any district that is served by municipal sewer and water infrastructure that allows residential development, multi-unit dwellings with 4 or fewer units shall be an allowed use. So each of those sentences is sort of its own topic. So first, in any residential district, duplexes shall be allowed with the same dimensional standards as a single family unit. The second topic is in a residential district served by sewer and water, and there's a definition of that later in this bill. Multi-unit dwellings of 4 units or less are an allowed use. So a town has to allow multi-unit dwellings of up to 4 units. Okay.
Bear with it. Let's get through it.
Yeah,
Big picture today.
once we get to 47, I'll have some questions.
I guess we all will.
So page 3 is another topic. Page 3 relates to, the first part relates to accessory dwelling units. So I won't read you every part of this definition, but currently under statutes, towns have to allow one accessory dwelling unit per single family home, as long as it is 900 square feet or less, or 30% or less of the single family in which it's attached to. And it also has to have separate facilities for sleeping, food preparation, sanitation, and sufficient wastewater capacity. But so currently under the statute, and this provision has existed for a long time, towns have to allow accessory dwelling units. So there's two clarifications to the statute. First, on line 5, a bylaw shall require a single family dwelling with an accessory dwelling unit to be subject to the same review as a single family home without an accessory dwelling unit. The statute previously was may. The thought, I think previously, was that some towns don't require any different level of review for an accessory dwelling unit. However, I think there was testimony that in fact, towns have become some towns are more strict on buildings with accessory dwelling units than buildings without. So this is trying to say that you shall have the same level of review for those with or without. Additionally, there's new language on line 7 that the criteria for conversion of an existing detached non-residential building to habitable space for an accessory dwelling unit shall not be more restrictive than the criteria used for a single family dwelling without an accessory dwelling unit. So that might include a garage or a carriage house, or maybe a barn. But an accessory dwelling unit can either be within the home or a building that's directly adjacent to the home.
It can be new construction.
It can, but this specific language is for an existing one. Yeah.
You said adjacent to, like on the same parcel.
Yeah, appurtenant to is what the statute says. Appurtenant to is a legal term that means within close proximity. Yeah, on the same parcel. All right, so at the bottom of page 3 is another topic entirely, subdivision H. So no bylaw shall have the effect of prohibiting or penalizing a hotel from renting rooms to provide housing assistance through the state of Vermont's general assistance program, or to any person whose room is rented with public funds. And the term hotel has the same meaning as in 32 VSA 9202. So this is about hotels that are renting to using the funds for those experiencing homelessness.
I do have a question.
All right, what's your question?
Thank you. Does this section here pertain to some of the issues that they're involved in Rutland right now, where the hotels are built to capacity with either low income or homeless families?
I don't really know the details of the Rutland situation, but this is talking about in municipal bylaws. The bylaws can't prohibit hotels from renting rooms to those who are funded by public assistance. So potentially, but I really don't know the details of that situation.
Okay, then I think I know the answer. So thank you.
On page 4, again, another new topic. Subdivision 12 is about density. So in any district served by municipal sewer and water infrastructure that allows residential development, bylaws shall establish lot and building dimensional standards that allow 5 or more dwelling units per acre for each allowed residential use. And density standards for multi-unit dwellings shall not be more restrictive than those required for single-family dwellings. So again, in these residential districts that have sewer and water, the town has to establish standards that allow 5 or more dwelling units per acre. Subdivision 13 is the density bonus provision. So in any district served by municipal sewer and water infrastructure that allows residential development, any mixed-use developments and affordable housing developments as defined in subdivision 4302 of this title, 4303 of this title, may exceed building height limitations by 1 additional habitable floor beyond the maximum height, and using that additional floor may exceed density limitations for residential developments by an additional 40%, provided that the structure complies with the building code. So if a municipality sets their bylaws up that based on the prior section, they allow 5 units per acre, someone building affordable housing can exceed any building height restriction they may have. So I think it's fairly common for towns to set either a 3-floor limit or a 4-floor limit on a building. They can exceed the floor maximum height restriction by an additional floor, and using that floor can exceed the density provision by 40%. So if it's a 5-unit density, 40% of that is 2 units. So they could use that additional floor to add 2 additional units so that the building could hold 7 instead of 5. If it's a larger development, it could potentially be more. That's sort of the simplest example. All right, number 14, slightly different topic. No bylaw shall have the effect of limiting the square footage of a duplex that otherwise complies with the applicable building code.
Building code. I mean, not every town has a building
Right, but there are state building code requirements.
for commercial properties.
And residential.
Go ahead, Representative Simmons.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think I'm being kind of thick here, but limiting this, so a bylaw saying you can only have like a 200 square, like, so basically bylaw, I guess I was thinking that the opposite is the challenge, like we're having issues with not having enough housing. So if a bylaw might actually try to go to more square footage, not less square footage.
Depends where you are. So that is what you just said may be true. I think that there was interest in economic development to make sure that they weren't limited, that they weren't putting additional limitations on a duplex, that they may or may not be putting out other types of building.
Can you give me an example? So
No.
Okay.
But to the chair's sort of question, I think that that last phrase otherwise complies with the applicable building code is redundant. Because hopefully a duplex isn't being built without complying with the applicable building codes.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of got me thinking about if I'm building a duplex that I'm going to live in half of it. Anyway, I don't want to go too much. We have to actually get through this bill today, so I would like actually to speed up, not slow down.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, so the last part of this section is the definition of area served by sewer and water. So you will have noticed that a few of the provisions in this section are tied to whether or not the provisions that require additional density are tied to whether or not there's municipal sewer and water. And so this section allows a municipality to define what that means for themselves. So as used in this section, an area served by municipal water and sewer infrastructure means And there are two options on page 5. That residential connections and expansions are available to municipal water and direct and indirect discharge wastewater systems, and not prohibited by state regulations or permits, identified capacity constraints, or municipally adopted service and capacity agreements. So that's sort of a default position. Is your municipal system already constrained by state regulation or permit, identified capacity constraints that the municipality has identified themselves? Or do you have a service agreement with another municipality that is already constraining your system? Or areas established by the municipality by bylaw, by ordinance or bylaw. So, or the municipality can establish areas by ordinance or bylaw that exclude flood hazard or inundation areas as established by statute, river corridors, or fluvial erosion areas as established by statute, shorelands, and wherever year-round residential development is not allowed, reflect identified service limits established by state regulations or permits, identified capacity constraints, or municipally adopted service and capacity agreements, which is the language from above. Exclude areas served by water and sewer to address identified community scale public health hazard or environmental hazard. Exclude areas serving a mobile home park that is not within an area planned for year-round residential growth. Exclude areas serving an industrial site or park. And so with those two, mobile home parks and industrial parks, there has been testimony that those are sometimes located outside of the other developed areas of a town. And so they may have run a line out to those areas specifically, but do not have development in between. And so can exclude those areas if their line is out for those areas specifically. And then finally, on page 6, exclude areas where service lines are located to serve the areas above, but no connections or expansions are permitted. Or modify the zoning provisions allowed under this chapter in areas served by indirect discharge designed for less than 100,000 gallons per day. So that list gives the town flexibility, but not full flexibility. So if the town has any of these either naturally occurring features with the fluvial erosion areas or the river corridors, or they've already defined areas of the town where they don't allow residential development to occur, or they've run the sewer line out to the mobile home park or an industrial park away from the village and they don't want to extend development in between, they can define in their bylaws that those areas are excluded from the areas that are required to have additional density. What it doesn't allow is for them, or the intention was so that they couldn't just exclude areas where they wanted low density in the area served by municipal water and sewer. And then there's a sort of overarching provision down in B, which says municipally adopted areas served by municipal water and sewer infrastructure that limit water and sewer connections and expansions shall not result in the unequal treatment of housing by discriminating against a year-round residential use or housing type otherwise allowed in the chapter. And that's a little bit what I was just saying, is that they can't use it to discriminate against housing when they are looking at these areas. The towns, in working on this, it was a little bit tricky to define specifically where sewer and water service areas are, particularly if towns have constraints on them from existing elements of their system. So this is giving towns some ability to define those areas, but they can't just get out of increasing their density. Okay, on page 6, section 3. All right, so this next section is related to homeless shelters. So the language that starts on page 6, so in the prior section, when a municipality sets up zoning districts, they have a lot of leeway in the types of things they can regulate as part of zoning. However, 4413 sets up this list, which identifies a number of uses that a municipality can't regulate every aspect on. It gives them a limited list of things they're allowed to regulate in regard to these things. And so the list includes state and community facilities, schools, hospitals, waste facilities. And so it's adding homeless shelters to it, but I'm going to read you the intro language first. So the following uses may be regulated only with respect to location, size, height, building bulk, yards, courts, setbacks, density of buildings, off-street parking, loading facilities, noise, traffic, lighting, noise, lighting, landscaping, and screening requirements, and only to the extent that the regulations do not have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use. So they can't outright prohibit any of these things. They can identify the locations where they are allowed, what districts they're allowed to occur in, but they have only a limited number of aspects that they can regulate on them.
Representative Sibilia.
So just they.
Municipality in their zoning, it's a limited subset of what they can regulate in the zoning.
They have to be allowed,
Yes,
and then they can put their area to regulate as how it affects the area, not
yes, not,
not denying it.
yes. So on page 7, it adds emergency shelters, and that definition is defined, I think, on the next page, so we will get to it, but that's the federal definition. And it basically is homeless shelters. But it adds additionally this language down on line 16 that says, for the purposes of this subsection, regulating the daily or seasonal hours of operation of an emergency shelter shall constitute interfering with the intended functional use. So it is again saying the town cannot regulate the daily and seasonal hours of operation because that interferes with the intended functional use. On page 8, section 4 is the definition section. So the first definition is accessory dwelling unit. There has been a definition of accessory dwelling unit for 30 years, but it's never been on this list of definitions. So this is just adding that the full definition is in 4412E, which is what I was talking about earlier. But the definitions of duplex and multi-unit or multifamily dwelling are the sort of new definitions here. So you will recall I've already used the word duplex in the zoning provisions earlier. And so this is defining that as a residential building that has 2 dwelling units in the same building, and neither is an accessory dwelling unit. And then skipping down to multi-unit dwelling, similar meaning this is a building that contains 3 or more dwelling units in the same building. So then there's the definition of emergency shelter. So the DCF requested that this be the definition that's used. This is the definition they used for federal funding that comes. And so this is what they currently use to get the grants for these facilities. So it's any facility, the primary purpose of which is to provide a temporary shelter for the homeless in general, or for specific populations of the homeless, and that does not require occupants to sign leases or occupancy agreements. All right. Section 5, we're still talking about municipal zoning, but a slightly different topic. So currently, when a town updates its zoning bylaws or adopts a new bylaw, they have to report that information to the Department of Housing and Community Development. And that language is already in this section, but there's a couple of modifications to this section. And so specifically on page 9, the report to the department has to include a number of things already, but it specifically has to include addressing sections 4412, 13, and 14, which are the sections I already went over with you. So 4414 is parking, 4412 is all that language about duplexes and increased density, and 4413 is the one about the homeless shelters. So it's requiring that, and I'll read you the full language starting on line 16. So upon adoption or amendment of a bylaw, the planning commission shall prepare an adoption report in form and content provided by the Department of Housing and Community Development that demonstrates conformity with sections 44, 12, 13, and 14 of this title, and provides information on the municipal application of subchapter 7, the bylaws, 9, administration, 10, the panels of this chapter for the municipal planning data center and the prospective development of a statewide zoning atlas. So this is asking the towns to provide more data on their zoning processes, and so that there can be a central system with this information, and perhaps in the future, a statewide zoning atlas. So a lot of this information is already required in the statute to be provided. This proposal is a little unusual because originally the proposal had a longer list of things, but this isn't, it's a little bit different than what's already required under the statute, but not a ton different than what's already required under the statute. So the next change on page 10, so we have section 6. Section 6 is about appeals in the municipal zoning process, the planning process generally, so it could be any aspect of the municipal decision process. So currently under the statute, there are a list of who constitutes an interested person in a municipal planning process. And so an interested person is a person who can appeal a municipal decision. So the existing list is in here 1 through 4. And number 4 is being changed. So it's 1 through 5, but number 4 is being changed. So currently under the statute, any 10 persons who may be any combination of voters or real property owners within a municipality may appeal a decision under this chapter. And so the language on page 11 modifies that so that it's any 10 persons who allege a common injury to a particularized interest protected under this chapter. And then maybe any combination of voters or real property owners within the municipality can challenge or appeal a decision. And then it also adds language further clarifying on line, or further language on line 16, for purposes of the subdivision, a particularized interest shall not include the character of the area affected. So particularized interest is the standard that's used under Act 250 appeals. And so currently this adding this language here would narrow potentially the people who could appeal a municipal decision, and have it more closely resemble Act 250, where there needs to be a shared injury that is injury to an interest protected under the chapter. And it's going further to say, but if that doesn't include the character of the area. So this is definitely new to this this section. There was interest in modifying this language, and so I do think it is more narrow than what currently exists under the chapter. But I guess I'll stop there because this is an issue about who gets to appeal a municipal decision likely related to a municipal zoning permit.
Can we just touch on the preceding ones? So person owning title to property.
Yeah, so currently, and this is the ones that aren't changing are a person owning title to property, or a municipality or solid waste management district who allege that the bylaws impose on the property unreasonable or inappropriate restrictions of the present or potential use under the particular circumstances. Number 2 is the municipality that has a plan or bylaw at issue in an appeal under this chapter, or a municipality that adjoins the municipality. So the municipality itself or an adjoining municipality. A person owning or occupying property in the immediate area of a property. Sorry, let me take a step back. Number 3 is a person owning or occupying property in the immediate neighborhood of a property that is subject to any decision. Who can demonstrate a physical or environmental impact on that person's interest under the criteria reviewed. Who alleges that the decision or act, if confirmed, will not be in accord with the policies, purposes, or terms of the plan or bylaw of that municipality. And then number 5 is any department or administrative subdivision of the state owning property or any interest in property within the municipality and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Is immediate neighborhood defined somewhere?
No, but it might be in the case law.
Thinking maybe we should take a 5-minute break. Back at 4:15.